This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 397 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner, and joining me for this episode is Greg Casey. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
I think this is the first time in the history of the podcast that I've ever done an interview with a son and then later done an interview with the father. But your last name, Casey, may be familiar to some people out there in the beer world, thanks to your son, Troy.
Yeah.
Although older heads out here in the brewing world certainly know your contributions through a number of different breweries, Molson, Carlsberg, Anheuser-Busch, Stroh's, Coors. You have worked for so many of important American breweries, in this capacity as a PhD scientist and yeast specialist, and also contributed to our understanding of lager yeast in a very significant way. The reason we're talking now is because in your retirement, you've reinvented yourself in a way as a historian. And I even remember in these early days of going out to Casey in Glenwood Springs that the whole family would come out for some of those early big releases. And I just have this particular memory of you with some old early 1900s brewing log or, some sort of book of those sorts, pulling it open and sharing, thoughts on brewing history with some of the folks that were there. And that's been a long time passion for you. You are now 2 books into a 5-book series that you are writing about the history of American lager brewing, published by Master Brewers. And we're going to talk through the course of this podcast about American lager brewing history. You are actually a Canadian by birth and a naturalized American citizen that have a deep love of America and obviously of American brewing. I mean, I guess we can talk about America in this sense that it involves Canada too, because North America is North America. But what I find is that so many American brewers, especially on this craft side, focus on the contributions of German brewers, of Czech brewers to the history of lager brewing. And we seem to overlook our own history here, even though our history of lager brewing, it only trailed some of the earliest developments of lager brewing in Europe by maybe 10 years at the most, maybe even less. And there's so much parallel, so much dynamic interplay between these worlds of brewing, much more than we tend to historically credit. And I can't wait through the course of this episode to kind of talk about how that cross-pollination happened, how the U.S. brewers influenced European brewers and vice versa, and watch how what we now know, as lager brewing in America over the last 10 years, taking an even different, weirder turn on the craft side, one that no one really predicted or would have at the early end of the craft room. Anyway, over the course of this episode, we're going to talk about American lager brewing history, and I can't wait to hit some of these high points with you, but also talk about some of your experience with yeast, lager yeast, and other things. Before we do that, for years, G&D Chillers has chilled the beers you love, partnering with 3,000 plus breweries across the country. They are proud of the cool partnerships they've built, offering 24/7 service and support. G&D builds with non-proprietary parts, expert craftsmanship, and constant innovation. G&D's in-house engineering crew have been piping breweries, wineries, and distilleries for over 30 years. They offer free piping design and consultation with the sale of every chiller they build. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. And it's time to stop worrying about diacetyl with Berkeley Yeast's line of fresh strains. These revolutionary yeast strains are engineered to produce the ALDC enzyme inside of the cell, preventing diacetyl before it forms. That means no more lengthy diacetyl rests, just clean, crisp beer that's ready to package sooner. Whether you're brewing a classic lager with fresh Ondex or a hazy IPA with fresh London, you'll get ultra low diacetyl levels and let your beer's true flavors shine. The team at Fireforge Craft Beer call it a cheat code and game changer for their hoppy beers. Learn more at berkeleyyeast.com/Fireforge. fresh. Also, every beer menu could use a refresh button on the fruit flavors. That's why it's time to revisit Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends, where the latest additions include fruit punch, guava, kiwi, and pomegranate. Old Orchard isn't stopping there and welcomes flavor suggestions from the brewing industry. For more information on free samples, they're waiting at oldorchard.com/brewer. That's oldorchard.com/brewer. Greg, we normally start off with a little bit of history. You've got a long and storied one, and of course, have been building more of your history, even in retirement over the last number of years. But let's try to track that down in a few minutes. Walk us through that kind of career development. What got you into this world of brewing, and those steps that your brewing career took through that?
Well, Jamie, when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist eventually, because as you know, in the early 70s, every kid wanted to be Jacques Cousteau. But I took a fermentation course. A guy by the name of Dr. Graham Stewart at Labatt's gave a lecture to us as kids, and I was like, oh, I could see the application of science to fermentation science. So fundamentally, I'm a applied brewing chemist. I wouldn't say chemist, but applied brewing scientist, and that the multidisciplinary approach that it required. So my first foray was I was going to actually be in Newfoundland as a management trainee person with Labatt's. And it had been scheduled for Saskatoon, where my wife was working, and I was supposed to go there, but then they had a strike, as Canadians often do. You seem to have a Scottish accent, say the Toronto transportation system shut down, no mail for. Anyhow, so that fell through. So plan B was a scholarship, a PhD funded scholarship in collaboration with Molson's in Saskatchewan on high gravity brewing. Back then, again in the late 70s, it was like the paradigm was, yeast aren't as alcohol tolerant as distillers yeast or sake yeast or whatever, but fundamentally it was all nutritionally limitations. And now high gravity brewing is the norm in the industry. After that, did a 2-year postdoc in Carlsberg. And that was transformative. That's why I'm sitting here, Jamie, as an American today, even though it was in Denmark. My first assignment was to create a genomic library of the same strain that Emil Christian Hansen isolated. And by the way, he first did it pure culture in the Tuborg brewery. Wouldn't let him do it at Carlsberg. He said, you prove it first, then we'll try that new thing called pure culture. So I made a genomic library, and towards the end of that time, the mentor, Dr. Pedersen, he taught me yeast chromosome fingerprinting. What is that? Well, if you think of a UPC code when you scan things in the supermarket, those little bands, think of those as chromosomes. And the paradigm again at that time was lager yeasts were really stable because you really couldn't introduce mutations into them easily. They're polyploid. But to make a long story short, realize there's like 5 sets of chromosomes, in terms of, they're not, we have 2, one from our mom and one from our dad, but they have 2 to 3 from each parent, the cold tolerant strain, the alcohol producing strain. And towards the end of that, there was a chance meeting in the hallway. Dieter von Wettstein, the director of Carlsberg, was taking August Busch and his entourage, August Busch III, through the brewery, through the research center. And August asked if there was anybody there working on yeast. And the Americans, he said. And they said, well, no, we got a Canadian. His English is excellent. Would you like to speak with him? This is literally what he said. I said, well, I'll do my, he kind of gave me a heads up. But anyhow, August had a sense that something was up with his yeast. He knew his beer. I mean, that man, he was every day, samples flying. You'd see the helicopters leaving and coming, delivering beer from all their breweries. And he knew when things were shifting. And I'll just say it led to, I was only there 4 or 5 years. And I think they got their money's worth, again, for proprietary reasons. But there was a culmination in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where the Brewmasters Conclave, where I gave my first formal findings to August the 3rd, fourth on his left, and a guy by the name of Gerhard Kramer, chief operating officer, incredible man. I mean, really built. I mean, he was the guy from an operations. And I gave my findings, and really excited, right? I had previously passed a test of fire in St. Louis in the old schoolhouse, where at the end of it, they said, okay, I believe you now, Casey. You can tell August. So I'm on a corporate jet. You know, my grandfather's second grade education. My dad didn't even get past first year of high school to start work for his dad. And so flying to Coeur d'Alene, I give my spiel. And they were literally, I have the imagery of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, because they were on a platform above where the plane of where everybody else was, the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. And August looks at me, and he then turned to Gerhard and said, Gerhard, do you believe this that Casey's talking about? I won't use profanity, Jim, I'm sure. And if
You're welcome to use whatever language you want here on the podcast. We mark it explicit. It's we're talking about beer. So
right. Well,
so there was some shit going down there.
There's some shit going down. And the first thing, he did, you know, when he turned to Kramer looked at him and said to August, Casey speaks the truth. It's the only time in my whole academic life, right? Truth is not a word we use in science, applied science. And he said, Casey speaks the truth. And then people said, he made the only joke they've ever heard him made when he said to me, Casey, why don't we make a yeast with no chromosomes? Then they can't change. And I'm standing there going, do I laugh? Do I say good idea? I said nothing. And that led to it was fun. I mean, I had a great time for applied science. None of it's published, but, it was a good tenure, but the culture fit wasn't a good one with me. I wanted to go to a place more like Coors, where I ended up. In between, went to Stroh. It was an opportunity to be near our families. We had our two sons, Troy and Chris at that point. So it was a short drive to Ontario, and it was great. Stroh was going to be bought by Coors there in like 91, 92, and then it fell through. But they cleaned out all the people. So I got to wear so many hats, both in research and development, the quality assurance system, mentors like Joe Hertrick in terms of malting and brewing science and how they integrate, taught me so much. But then when they went out, Coors, and that's where I finished my career. I loved it.
And so what did you finish your career? What was your title at Coors?
My last title, Applied Brewing Technology. Applied Brewing Technology. I forget, because I had so many. I was corporate quality assurance director for many years. That's when I identified. We created a quality system built around enabling and operating processes where we were able to drill down to every single value-added function in the supply chain as to how their function influenced Rocky Mountain Refreshment. Again, none of this is published, but from looking from the outside in, most of my career with Coors before that, I knew that there was improvements that could be made, just let's put it that way, in consistency. Not that it was a bad beer, it's just that it was inconsistent. We got it done right. And, we were I worked with some incredible people, looking at the team that pulled this off, because, you may recall Coors used to ship everything refrigerated, right? Don't do that anymore. Well, why? Well, credits and debits, you can build in credits into the supply chain to knock out that cost and not have the beer affected. So there, to me, that's an applied science all the way from, the really raw materials through to package and everything in between. And, getting individuals at the source. It's a trite expression, quality at the source. But when you talk to people, you look them in the eye, and after first introducing, well, what's DMS? What's diacetyl? What's, DMSP? All these things. And then 2 years later, they're playing the terms back to you relative to the linkage to the quality objectives. It was good. It was good. So that,
you can see the effect. You can see it, the kind of getting ingrained in the culture then.
Yeah. And I had the barley breeding program. I was, in charge of that for, I guess, like last 10 years. I got a picture of me in the first volume with Bill at one of those barley field days. So I got to learn a lot about the other raw material, barley. But my real passion was yeast is what was good to us. yeast is what Troy has taken to a whole other level, right? With Belgian sours. I'm like, I have no idea to brew what he brewed. I have no idea. I mean, father and son, yeah, we might be in the industry, but our passions are for completely different styles of beer. And his flora is one I did everything to keep out of the brewers my whole career.
Sure. Well, it makes for an interesting story, and certainly broad and kind of cool to see. Even though you have a shared passion for beer that it expresses in different ways and through different channels.
I'm so proud
there.
of him. I had no idea. He's a small business owner. I mean, all craft brewers out there, man, I have a tremendous respect. It's just I've seen what it takes, and I see it's. You got to have the passion to see it through, because you're going to need that as fuel for sure, as well as a little bit of good luck and a vision. But yeah, it really opened my eyes of what it takes to do.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this history of American lager brewing, and I want to kind of go back and kind of hit some high points through this American lager history, since this is such a historical passion for you. Let's talk about that. But first, Oregon-based Indie Hops is expanding possibilities for brewers in 2025. Strata, Indie's original hop release, is now available in cold side flowable hop oil form. Strata Hyper Boost, in coordination with Yakima Chief Hops. Indie Hops T90 pellets established the multi-layered Strata experience, while cryogenic CGX pellets, in coordination with Crosby Hops, and now Strata Hyper Boost with YCH, expand the possibilities. Learn more about Strata and Indie's more recent hop releases at www.indiehops.com. Indie Hops, life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And upgrade your fermentation game with Unitake 2.0 from SS Brewtech, featuring a laser-welded cooling jacket for efficient and precise temperature control, an innovative silicone racking arm, and a carbonation stone that allows you to carbonate right in the fermenter. Unitank 2.0 is engineered to help you get the most out of your fermentations. Available from 7-gallon up to 1-barrel sizes, Unitank 2.0 will be right at home in your homebrew setup or producing pilot batches at your commercial brewery. Visit ssbrewtech.com to learn more. All right, Greg, as you started tackling this historical problem of telling this history of American lager brewing, where did you start?
Well, I was, as I mentioned earlier, director of corporate quality assurance at Coors for most of my tenure there. It was a chance literature search. And people that will laugh, you were on the internet. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of I missed it in the 80s and 90s. I just wasn't. I still remember the people that taught me the return button and all this other stuff. But I was doing the literature in terms of caustic. Caustic is obviously used globally in terms of cleaning and sanitizing any surface that is going to be in contact. And we were doing it by the sodium test. You do process capability, you're plotting it over time, you're seeing this is what because sodium comes from not just caustic, but the raw materials as well. And then if you see a process shift and statistically it's significant, I had the job of going to a plant manager and really pissing them off saying, I don't think we should be packaging this. And, it's and they're like, well, you got to do something that's more direct, whatever. So it was a chance search for the science, what could we find? And in the course of that, I came across a reference. It was from 1890. It was called the Turner Adulteration Bill. And what it was a bill that was both in the House and the Senate that was drafted in order to ban the use of corn and rice to brew adjunct lager beer in the United States. And I'm like, what? I'm looking at this going, spelling out prison sentences, confiscation of property, blah, blah, blah. If you sold beer and it had corn rice and the consumer didn't know it. I'm like, well, that's wild, 1890. And I started asking around at Coors, anybody know of this? And I was blessed to know Bill Coors. I mean, I consider him the best applied brewing and malting scientist of the 20th century. I really do. He taught me something every time we interacted. I like to think I did, but I knew he was the master and I was the student. And so it sort of triggered, and this was I retired 2013, this was like 2008-ish. I started delving into it. I've always loved history. Even before I wanted to be a marine biologist, I wanted to be a history teacher. But in Ontario, the jobs had dried up, so I said, okay, I'll be a marine biologist. But I started digging into it, and I was probably spending 20-30% of my time on that, most, some at work, but at home. And 17 years later, I've got like now 17,000 primary period references from 1840s to 1940s. And I went, holy smokes. I mean, in terms of, it's an ultimate process survey, if you will. As a scientist, I talk about that. You need to do that to get process control. You can't just assume it's one value added point. And I realized we don't know our history as Americans. We just don't. In general, I'd say that's a fair statement. I think we can always be better understanding. But when it came to our beer, I was like, we don't have a clue. I didn't have a clue. And I thought, okay, I knew my retirement was coming. I knew I was going to be able to have a long one. Didn't need a source of income. Just dedicate myself to studying that history and then writing about it. And what I found, there's so many myths. I mean, the story of American beer, I call it the paint of the 5W whitewash. It's like when, where, who, what, in terms of particularly the adjunct lager beer. Oh, World War II, the malt was short. They used a quart of rice, and then they, used bikinis and jumping out of planes to sell beer to the dumb American public. Well, I was like, it's a little more complicated than that. It revealed to me a history that totally, it was different, and it's reflected in the series title because you'll see two words there, inspiring and legacies. Now, you wouldn't associate those words typically because it's overwhelmingly adjunct lager beer, right? But it was a story on so many levels in each of these periods between the 1840s and 1940s that I was inspired as an American and also as a brewer, applied brewing scientist. As I'll be getting into in the 5th volume, 1842 is often out there as, Frederick Lauer in Reading, Pennsylvania, which I always love telling my son that's the same place Taylor Swift was born. And he always, don't go there, Dad. But it's earlier than that, and with ChatGPT, I mean, it's incredible what you could do in terms of, taking German newspapers from York, Pennsylvania, all these German communities across the United States. It's like, oh, okay, no, we had German, mostly a Dunkel style lager as early in the 1830s. And it was almost exclusively enjoyed in the German communities at that time.
Well, let's jump back to that. And, as we were talking ahead of this episode and kind of plotting this out, I remarked to you that it kind of hit ahead for me when I was in the Hops Museum in Žatec, in the Czech Republic, that even the history of Czech hop growing, they reference the American brewers and their use of Czech hops pretty significantly. And it hit me as I'm looking at this, like, wait, the timing here between the advent of lager brewing in the Czech Republic and then, that quickly kind of went back and forth, between there and Germany is so intertwined with the same timeline in the United States. Like, it's almost simultaneous. It's not nearly like American lager brewing is not nearly as derivative. I mean, it's only as derivative as you might say German lager brewing is of Czech lager brewing. It all happened at the same time and kind of happened simultaneously in all of these different ways. But, talk to me about the advent of lager brewing in the United States back in those very earliest of days.
Yeah, I'm pretty, again, I just take period references. Nothing is, my job as author is to give the reader the context of what was happening in the world at the time, be it First World War, Second World War, American Civil War in one case too, so that they can hear the voices of the people that lived it. It's obviously, I could delve into the gory technical details and the statistics, but that's not my audience because it's an inspiring history and there's legacies denied, I feel, that of them. And we owe it to them now, like 100, 150 years later, I believe, to make the pitch. Yeah, these are Americans that believed and profoundly influenced our national culture. Ken Grossman writes about that as one of the forward authors in terms of the impact lager beer had on the United States as becoming our national beverage. But yeah, it was Dunkel, 1830s. 1832 is the earliest where I've got a bona fide. Yeah, that's I even mentioned Hefe yeast, in terms of a new German brewery being built in York, Pennsylvania, whatever. And it was just in the German communities. And that was true 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. 1850s. It was 1860s. It was the beer of the Deutschman, right? It wasn't the Americans. It was the Germans' time to take the abuse of transitioning to becoming an American, just as the Irish did and everybody else. But surname Casey, right? So I'm familiar with that one. But yeah, but then Pilsner hit the world in the 1870s, and it exploded globally. It became the beer of.
It was the hazy IPA of its time, maybe even more than the hazy IPA of its time.
And
I love it because I hear so many brewers these days talking about how hazy IPA is the death of beer. But man, we've had this conversation so many times through the history of brewing. Whether it was stout and porter, but obviously Pilsner, beautiful, but also one of the most destructive forces in the history of beer. Anyway, I'm interrupting you.
Yeah, no, it first came over to the United States. I mean, like it went everywhere, right? I mean, Helles,
almost
even
immediately.
the Bavarians
right.
said, "Shit, we got to do something to compete with this. We can't keep making Dunkels." Or they did, but wheat beers and all the other. But they added it to their portfolios of beers. But we, as Americans, had a very distinctive cultural difference compared to consumption of Pilsner beer in anywhere in Austro-Hungarian Empire or the German Empire. And it fundamentally was this. We liked to drink beer back then, not out of a stein. We liked to drink it out of a glass so we could see it. We liked it ice cold, still do. I mean, not ice cold, but much colder than Europeans. And we drank it fast. We didn't linger. It was 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. Our prohibition. We were capitalism on hormones. I mean, it was
Industrial Revolution,
American
more money in people's pockets.
Bingo,
right.
And part of I like to work in vignettes.
Ability to transport products in a way that was not possible decades before that.
Across the continent, and in order to be able, it's chill proof, right? For about 3 decades, only American lager beer was the only chill proof beer in the world because the Germans didn't need to have a chill proof. Nobody else. We did. And everything that evolved in terms of the development in the United States, in terms of how do we deliver that to our consumer, not just at the brewery, but that we can ship it by rail to the Grand Canyon and still have it in the heat of the dock and still be put on ice and still be crystal clear. No other brewer could do that. And there was, I talked in the series, what
was it that American brewers did that made that possible?
Well, part of it was obviously the use of adjuncts. We were 6-row barley, 6-row malt, solution to pollute, in terms of the two coming together, chill haze. You could dilute they called them the albuminoids, they called it. But they introduced, so that was only part of it. By 1890s, probably about 80% of the beer in the United States was 30-40% lager beer of 30-40% adjunct. That was the beer of America at the end of the 19th century. But you also had...
What was the yeast primarily back then, too?
Well, the yeast, it's funny because part of my research, this fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Wall. I mentioned Bill Coors is the 20th century. He was the 19th century American. This guy, he was a brewing scientist. He set up like a Siebel's equivalent and academy that competed and taught. He developed QA programs, and he brought back pure culture yeast technique from Carlsberg. And I didn't realize the night I was knocking on that door when we were almost a day delayed getting to Carlsberg because of Air Canada snafu, and it's raining, and there's a big note at the door like at 1 a.m. saying, "Dr. Casey, you're late." Nobody was there. I was like, "Oh, these Danes are a little direct." But he had walked through that same door almost 100 years prior to learn from Hansen himself how to introduce pure culture yeast in the United States, and he brought it back. I know for sure that of the two, and I call it Carlsberg versus Tuborg type yeast,
right?
Because I had pure cultures of both. I mentioned earlier he did the Tuborg brewery, and there were UPC code differences. I had no idea what it meant. I was really excited when I saw they all didn't look the same, because being applied, I'm like, I can show August or Peter Stroh or somebody else, look, yours looks like this and your competitor's yeast. What does it mean? Well, that's a whole different matter. And the Carlsberg type yeast dominated the United States, because fundamentally it's a brewer's dream. You can run it over with a truck. You can ask to wash it, and it'll look at you and say, "That's all you got." But inherently, it's a more sulfury, less estery beer. And as the American beer, evolved to lighter and lighter, the Tuborg, which is I call it the prima donna. You got to treat it right. You can't abuse it in yeast management processes. If you do, especially as we started producing Coors in different countries around the world, right? They're like, "What the hell is this?" Well, it's worth it. It is. Yeah, it's not a problem. Trust me. And I had an opportunity to look at when I was at Anheuser-Busch and Coors and Stroh, everybody else's yeast, because everybody collects it, 1950s, long closed breweries. And like 98% of the yeast were this Carlsberg type. The only two were breweries by the name of Coors and Anheuser-Busch. And towards the end of Carlsberg, Stroh days, we were able to convert the Longview, Texas brewery to the Tuborg type strain. And it was the only market without any advertising in the last 6 months before going out of business that saw an increase in sales. When I just we had done home use tests and all that, but to convert a whole, that was an applied moment. And you could see, because I remember when I came to Coors, they're like, well, the pH is a little higher in the Longview, Texas beer, and the ADF's, kind of a little shifted. And I just smiled. I can't, I guess I'm saying it now, sort of. But so that was yeast. But the Pils, it was the materials, it was corn and rice, certainly double mash system, in terms of decoction versus infusion, the use of cookers to be able to take a portion of that was essential. And in terms of the precursors, in terms of formation of chill haze, the protein component.
There weren't necessarily processed rice solids or corn, processed products that they could add as we did now. They had to do their own cooking back then.
You mentioned you were in Czech Republic.
Yeah.
My wife and I were in Europe late last year. Went to the Vienna National Library because there was a fellow by the name of Ludwig von Hager. And he developed a patent, U.S. patent, 1862, on the use of Indian corn to brew lager beer. He came over to the United States and spent the entire year on both sides, both in the Confederacy and the Union. About 2 years later, he wrote a book saying, here's where I went, and here's where we did trials with corn. And they weren't at that time, the double mash cook. No, that wasn't. They did their best, but he named names. He said, "This is the brewery in New York and New Jersey. This is the brewery in Kentucky. This is." He spent a whole year, and he mentions little stories like we. Got run out of town in Indianapolis when they got wind, the local German community, that they were doing trials with corn to replace malt. They got run out of town. He fell first, So it was, I wouldn't say it was necessarily readily accepted en masse in the German, but once we started to lightning in being able to deliver that, brew house design, sugar croissants, everything that you could think of, to reduce the load, if you will, that beer. And they couldn't believe it. 1911, they came over here. The global community came here for American brewing, everything, the supplies, the materials. We, not German companies, were building breweries around the world. China, South African breweries, Mexico, every continent. It was American companies, all got shut down in Prohibition, right? But they were built. We were building the breweries of the world. Heineken, he sent his sons to Chicago to learn how to brew American-style beer.
Martin Cornell was writing about that recently, about this kind of wave in the 1890s of UK English, brewing businesses buying American breweries.
Oh yeah,
because there was that whole wave of acquisition. History echoes itself; it rhymes. That you have foreign acquisition because some of the American brewers were growing, and there was so much possibility and potential with that.
They had more money. The empire was at it, and they were gobbling these up.
Those buyers ended up selling the breweries back to the founders of those breweries.
I know. It didn't work. The investors didn't get their money. No. I kept thinking, oh, good. They were Americans. They figured it out. We're going to make
the American brewers bought it back for
Song.
pennies on the dollar, but they had they did well. And like a strange story that kind of reminds me of some breweries right now in the whole craft world.
Well,
but,
I talk about that. Maybe a
Yeah.
quick divert. When I look at and fundamentally, this I want to say a couple of principles that from looking at this history. There's been two beer revolutions in the United States. First, the adjunct lager brewing, the development of perfection of a chill-proof lager beer that became the dominant beer in the marketplace. And Dick Yangling, who also wrote a foreword, he talks about that from the perspective of a family that was living it. And that's been going like 150 years, so that revolution. The second revolution I call the craft revolution, right, in 1980s to today. And I find it astonishing, and I write about this in the second volume, in terms of the parallels between the first 50 years of the first revolution and what's going on today. Both started with a style of beer that was, evolved to be quite different than where it started. An English, an American IPA was nothing like a British IPA. Likewise, by the 1890s, 1880s, our lager beer was not a German lager or a Czech lager, whatever. But that sort of evolution, the move to lightness, like 30 years later, you start hearing sessionability and, the craft world, right? Well, you look at the data and what was going on. Our lager beer was becoming lighter. It was becoming more drinkable. And, the consolidation, that's what triggered this. We started to see around this same period, I mentioned about, which craft brewers have been, Sapporo, Suntory, and, all the others. Nothing wrong with that. It's just business. But they had that same thing in their first half century. And I believe fundamentally, they called them flowering times, Blutzeiten. And Blutzeiten, to my German listeners, sorry if I bastardize that, but it's called flowering times. And we had multiple flowering times where our national beer, got progressively lighter. One was, we had a flowering time when the Germans, the Dunkel style, 1830s, 1870s. And then we had a flowering where you Americans, as they would tell people trying to shut them down from using corn and rice, we had a flowering time then where the beer was, less, it was more drinkable and it was better suited to the lifestyle. And then we had then we had Prohibition. I mean,
can't call it that, but yes,
deep dive into whatever. But yeah,
a wilting time. Yes,
we never
pulled up by the roots.
We had our peak per capita and barrel production on an annual basis in the year like 1912, 1914 period. Just for First World War was on, but we were 1917. We didn't get back those numbers until the third flowering, which was the period during the war and after the war, where not out of choice but out of necessity, we made a lighter beer. And as I get into there in terms of adjuncts shutting down, malt being limited to roughly about in low to high 90s, depending on the window, they were guaranteed they could get that much malt. But we saw the volume of beer go from something like 50 million barrels in 1941 to 96 billion or something like that at the end. And the beer was the lightest beer we had ever made to that point in time. So it was kind of like, was that just an accident? Was that the consumer? Was it wartime? Whatever. But in between these flowering times,
there's a little bit of pragmatism and necessity within the business, as well as
3-2 beer. Our beer, the 15%. The military, their first beer was a 3-2 beer. Pretty much, it was a 3-2 beer, not by legislation domestically, but in effect, it was. And then we kind of once, it got harder during feeding the world, in terms of broken supply chains. But by 1948, we were back to business as usual.
Let's go back and I want to talk about pre-prohibition, before we get too far and too deep into this, and then kind of, keep tracking up, especially through, because prohibition absolutely was just a incredible pivotal moment, and the way the breweries survived. We love to think that this might, the current time is always the worst time in history, that somehow the headlines are out there, his craft beer's keg kicked, this is the end of it. And listen,
Yeah.
let's talk about when it has been worse in history. It has been worse many, many times, much worse than this in history before. And as you say, this goes in cycles and things come. I want to talk about that pre-Prohibition period and some of how that brewing process evolved in those days, especially as more tools came to brewers, ingredients, access, everything else. But first, did you know that Isuzu trucks have been the best-selling low cab forward trucks in America every year since 1986. That's right, for over 38 years, the legendary durability, remarkable performance, and low cost of ownership of Isuzu trucks have made them a favorite for work truck owners. You may have seen their ultimate craft beer truck that debuted at the Craft Brewers Conference in 2019 and has been there every year since. As members of the Brewers Association, they've partnered with breweries, suppliers, and distributors alike to support the craft beer industry. Whether you're looking for a self-distribution solution or one to deliver supplies, there's an Isuzu truck that'll fit your needs. Go to IsuzuCV.com to check out their impressive lineup or visit an Isuzu dealer today to find out why. Now, more than ever, Isuzu trucks are the trucks you trust for the work you do. And tickets for the Craft Beer Brewing 2025 Brewers Retreat in Asheville and Mills River, North Carolina are on sale now and going fast. Brew on homebrew systems with some of the most inspiring craft brewers in the U.S., like Vinny and Natalie Chilurzo of Russian River, Evan Price of Green Cheek, Mark Josephson of Scratch, Bob Coons of Highland Park, Chris Johnson of Green Bench, of Coasts, Ken and Brian Grossman of Sierra Nevada, and more. Learn more and secure your tickets at brewersretreat.com. So let's step back and keep following this kind of arc forward in that pre-Prohibition period. Using corn varieties, interesting to you mentioned Indian corn, going through these double mash processes, cereal cooking, in order to. What were some of the other kind of pivotal moments in that pre-war period when it came to making lager beer?
Well, it was that you just mentioned a list of technological innovations. And I love to provide readers with vignettes. In 1912, the United States Brewers Association met in Chicago, and there's a fellow, VLB in Berlin.
Yeah.
Vintage, he was the in charge at the time. He came over. He was met at the dock by an American reporter because the U.S. was just the first use of the Smithsonian was the culmination of a final push in Washington for the hearings to finally ban corn and rice. And they didn't succeed only because of lawyers, but I'll tell you that at a different time. Thank God. But he asked
American agricultural interests we're not going to ban this.
In 1890, they were subtle. They were behind the scenes, and that's what killed it. When McKinley heard the malting industry was approached by somebody advocating to say, I will agitate in the press to get this banned. If you give me money, I will go to D.C., agitate. And it was the malting industry that was funding it, and to a lesser extent, barley growers. But they forgot to realize a lot of brewers were maltsters too. So when they read that letter into the hearings in Congress, McKinley said, well, chairs means and ways. He said, this is commerce. This is not food safety. So it was killed. But back to vintage, he got off, and the reporter, because the media was also a big part of, we should be having real beer, pure beer, German beer. And he was asked his thoughts on that, because they had just, in June 3rd, 1906, the German Empire joined Bavaria, 1516. But my grandfather was alive when the Empire joined banning the use of corn and rice and other adjuncts for lager beer. Up until that time, they were using it, and domestically. And, Vintage, in his interview, New York Journal of Commerce, he's like, oh, hell no. This law was only passed for the agricultural interests in Germany. It restricts the development and creation of different types of beer. So Vintage was basically echoing like, no, you should have the freedom, but they didn't. But then when he finally got to Boston to give his talk, in the course of that, he says, we, referring to Germany, we have been your faithful pupils. In terms of learning, you mentioned earlier in terms of, they start to use adjuncts, but we were doing things as we were building breweries around the world that they realized. And then he proceeded to give shit to the Americans. You don't pay enough attention to us, which I thought was funny, But yeah, so that was a fascinating vignette that was very revealing in terms of that global dynamics of what was going on. To have Vintage say, "We have been your faithful pupils," it's like, wow, that's kind of not.
It's not the way we think about that.
Not the way we think about that. And as you know, I mean, I've shared this history with German senior members of the German brewing industry who will remain anonymous, but to an individual or they, so it's not he, it's they. This is history that's not known to them. That the use of saccharin was only banned in 1898, and once it was, Vintage writes a report about brewers were given drivers packets of saccharin so that the consumer could add it to their ale to make a sweet beer, because it's a sweet beer. And I've talked to Jerry, what this sweet beer was? No idea. And saccharin? No idea. And it's, it's not what I expected to see either. But it just blew me away collectively. And it made me realize we, at that point, like that 50th century, it was internal. We were, and another parallel with the craft, we were influencing the second revolution at about the same amount of time, incubating in the United States, making it different than the countries of origin, their history. They were, the spirit of innovation and creation, and we're not afraid to mess with things, right? It's in our DNA. You're not going to be prescribed, this is what you must do. That first revolution, by about 50 years, they were influencing the global. You were seeing export of not just beer, but as I mentioned earlier, the products, things like, cornflakes, pre-gelatinized adjunct sorts, high, glucose. They called it glucose then, but it's basically high fructose, but high glucose corn syrups of various degrees of fermentability. I mean, there were these innovations, even hop extracts. There was plants in the 1870s in upstate New York that were creating hop extracts. That blew me away.
Really?
One way of, the
I've been to the old hop growing fields up there around Cooperstown and
yeah. Well, they were one of the, as I talk about in the 5th volume, the hop growers of New York were one of the biggest pain in the ass to the American brewing industry, because they were trying to ban, they were part of that 1890 legislation. Hops, it's got nothing to do with adjunct lager beer, but they figured if brewers were using any other non-traditional ingredients, they've probably not used natural hops, and they couldn't understand how the traditional annual crop could be uncoupled based on the ability, and it was Walkerville in the 1870s, to make hop extracts. So, I mean, there's just so many examples that cumulatively, bit by bit, I mentioned credits and debits in terms of flavor stability, but in terms of physical stability, that you could integrate in your supply chain, be it materials, be it whatever. And it was a marvel. So yeah, the craft today, and we're just in Europe, anybody, I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's my only social. I really don't, my grandfather, when I was 10, said, "Greg, protect your privacy." He didn't even have a grade 2 education. And I don't know what, and so today's world, it's good advice. But yeah, we see that second after the incubation domestically going in the world. And when you look at the global sales, and that's what, getting back to the Germans, they're like, there was the Craft Brewers Conference here in Denver, 4 or 5 years ago? Yeah. And I had a head of one of the major academies around a fire pit there in our place in Perry Park, Colorado, saying the perception in America is we have no brewing history, we have no brewing heritage, we have no brewing traditions, that those are only being started in the craft world. And he looked at me in astonishment. He said, "How can you say that?" I said, they had just done a global survey. And I'll never forget, as I was having him drink a Coors, and he would be, another adjunct lager beer. And when I'm over there, it's always his beer. But he was saying, we did a global survey, and roughly about 80% of the beer in the world, he said, and he pointed at me, is yours. How could you say that? And, it's just that kind of excitement that I realize the degree to which these two revolutions and the commonalities have influenced. I'm very proud of it. And I say the series is not a us versus them, where the us is the macros of the world I lived in, the beer factories and the beer behemoths of Anheuser-Busch and Coors and all the others, and them being the craft. Now, this whole series is about U.S. and them, the U.S. being the United States, and the Belgians, and the British, and the Germans, in terms of influencing through their cultural development of their industry. It's astonishing, So I really, people might think I'm just trying to, spin the world I lived in, but no. Anheuser-Busch Coors are barely mentioned throughout the 5 series because it's virtually all people that have long been forgotten, and those are the legacies tonight.
Absolutely. So let's kind of keep tracking back. We go into Prohibition, and now all of us know what happened there. We know how many of these, how we went from 3,000 plus breweries to basically zero, and the companies that were able to survive made it through with other products or related things and whatnot. They scrapped through. Led to massive amounts of consolidation after Prohibition. But then, of course, after Prohibition, we very quickly go into World War II, which led to, as you say, resource constraints, upset all the global markets. The United States changed, manufacturing processes and to focus on the war effort. Agriculture was, feeding our troops. It was not, necessarily, so those things had some pretty, big impacts on our approach to brewing. People still wanted beer, but it had to be made in some different ways. Talk about how some of those global events, changed the way the beer was produced in the United States.
Yeah, great question. We know Prohibition ended in 1933, right? So when Prohibition ended, the industry brought to the market a heavier lager beer, actually, based on, pounds of materials per barrel. In terms of a century, you could see the numbers go. Then it was in those peak years that I mentioned before Prohibition. I have basically a paradigm that if it's left to the brewer, they're going to make a heavier, more bitter than the consumer would want.
Remains true today.
It remains true, yeah. And, so I was struck by from 1933 to about 1937, beer sales increased. You'd expect that. But then it started to decline. It started to drop. And I'm like, what? I mean, it was still, I thought the early days that, Americans should have been thrilled, but it was still that heavier beer. Then came the war. Then came the unplanned.
But that drop came before the war itself. In 37, right?
Yeah,
we were in the war
37,
then.
Yeah, we were, 37, 38, 39. I was able, in New Ulm to look at the books of the brewing logs of the August Shell, and seeing it brew the formulation on December 7, 1941. It was just a little moment, and Stan Hieronymus was there with me to share it. But the beer was heavier compared to what it was before Prohibition. It came out with a bang, but it came nowhere near the levels and actually started to decline. And it started to tick up towards 41, 42 in terms of, there were no material restrictions significantly, and right up all of 1942 was business as usual, if you will, in terms of the availability of adjuncts and malt. But then in 1943 is when it really hit the fan. And it was, you could see the numbers. It had started to shift to be a slightly lighter beer, but not significantly. And then 43 hit. And hogs, the hogs of America led to a corn crisis because of, Lend-Lease and shipping hogs over to Britain, wartime Britain, to feed. And they were hoarding their corn because government had set prices back from the Depression era, and they could, it wasn't a free market. So they realized, okay, it's going to be fixed at these uses. And if I allocate this or keep it on the farm to grow hogs, I'll make a lot more money from the corn. And in summer of 43, it just dried up. I mean, core supplies, there was never federal legislation that said, no, you can't you can't sell or use rice or corn for these purposes. It was the marketplace that drove it. And breweries actually shut down. They in the Midwest, you get newspaper reports about we're not going to brew because we can't get corn or rice. It was mostly corn. And you see headlines in the newspapers, and I love seeing that in terms of hogs get corn, beer gets scarce, stuff like that, and it's just really cool. So they shut down. And that forced the availability of malt was, as I mentioned, in the low 90%, but then that 50 to 90 million barrels. Well, how the hell did that happen? Well, when you're fixed in the malt and you grow like that, you're going to have to change the formulation. And there's a graph in the second volume where you see, if you have, that's, I guess, with an audio, you're not seeing my hands, but, you see the percent malt come down to a certain level. It dropped from about 70% to as low as 50, and adjuncts come up, and they get this inflection point, and then they go back to normal, almost normal, to back what it was like in 38, 39, and 40. And then it started a per cap, a slight decline. But yeah, that happened in the war, and corn starch in particular had so many uses for military purposes, like all those shell casing stuff with starch. Obviously, corn was a food. Same deal with rice. You got troops all around the world, and they were multiple uses, but it wasn't federally banned. It was the use and sense of patriotism, obviously. Let's get these, let's win this damn war, and then move on with being Americans. But then, so that's when we started, and Ken Grossman gets into a bit of this, started using alternative materials. First of all, it was barley flakes and barley grits. Rahr Malting Company, I think you mentioned it a little, and Freighter then, I think International Malting now. They put ads in newspapers or trade journals, like big things. Corn grits are missing, use this, and it's like, that's a visual for the reader to go, well, that doesn't fit the paradigm of, just using corn. So that was 43, so barley flakes. But then, with the increased volume growth, we started in 44 using sorghum grains and soybeans as a significant percentage. Ever since 1860, whatever it was, 61, 62, when the federal government required every brewer in the United States of America to record every pound of every material used, right? Well, you can get that data, and you see things that were zero all of a sudden being in tens of millions of pounds. Things like sorghum grains, things like even 45, 46, 47, cassava, tapioca, I mean, anything that they could get a starch source. And often more expensive, as it was in the 1870s to brew compared to 100% malt. So, but when the war ended, what was the supply chain status of the world? Well, it was shot to hell, right? Even in some allied countries, but certainly in Europe and Japan. And I think it was Morgenthau, driving back. No, there was a decision, we are going to get these nations back on their feet. We being United States, Canada, Australia, people are starving. And if people are, starving, they're not going to be political stability or societal. This is before.
We learned that lesson the second time.
Yeah, we did.
Maybe not the first time, but yeah.
Very good point. Very good point. And it worked. It got them through that period. Then the Marshall Plan kicked in, but you got to be able to eat and work before you can, implement that. Right. So to me, that's an inspiring thing too. That American brewers, and you read it in their annual meetings. Yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to figure out how to make an adjunct lager beer with tapioca, cassava, sorghum grains, barley. I mean, it's just, to me, as a applied scientist, it was cool. But
wait, weird adjuncts in beer? It's weird. It's the history of American brewing right there.
It's our DNA. Ken Grossman talks about that too. Like, it's very.
Your pastry stouts and your pastry sours, all of those have precedent. Well,
I think
tapioca beer, not new.
I think my son's getting a lot of pressure to put dandelion sour. I think he's resisting his the extended membership say, do a dandelion sour. He's not going to do it. So, but so it was. Then it went back to business as usual.
Right.
And so then it's you just saw relative to a slow Verkunken or something like that decline period. Then in the 70s, when you had the light American beer revolution, that was a specifically drafted, designed to give the consumer a more drinkable, lighter beer. That wasn't external events around the world made us make a lighter beer. It was like, and then we got back to a beer that was pretty close to what the beer of 43, 44, 45, 46 was.
Except with more enzymes this time too.
Well, you mentioned acetolactate decarboxylase. I'll take you back to something you said there. When I was president of the American Society of Brewing Chemists, I gave a talk in Japan thanking them for, they were doing really all the basic research in the industry in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and onward. And one of the Japanese individuals came up to me afterwards and described diacetyl as thus. He said, "It is morning after sickness flavor." So basically, I interpreted that as the keto smell of puke on a bar floor the morning after. The ketone. I mean, I see the connection, but that was the most, maybe not to be used in the marketing for that. But so I diverse. Back to you.
Sure. So then, yes, we see this light beer revolution. We see using enzymes to push these yeast to, further attenuate and, but also create beers that people could drink lots of. And you also, that was also tied to this kind of growth of post-war marketing, 60s and 70s, the ability to reach consumers and sell them on these ideas, to spread these ideas. It became more and more efficient. You had now, television audiences that were tuned in, and you could tell some of these stories, and these bigger companies had the budgets to do these. They could change the entire scope of that product.
Totally.
Yeah.
And in that environment, we still had, I think, 76 breweries it got down to. Right after the war, they were in the multiple hundreds. But again, all those, virtually all with Anheuser-Busch and Coors were using Carlsberg type yeast. I know that because I saw them. And, so as a beer, particularly when the light beer revolution, the 100-calorie light beer, that's, I love to tease craft brewers saying, hey, the world I lived in, we weren't extracting flavors from dead plant tissue, hops. My mission was to work with the company, to work with the teams to tease out the yeast byproducts of metabolism that gave you that slightly fruity note you can get in a Coors and a Bud Light to keep DMS down. And they went by, and then it consolidated into just a handful of the macros. But we peaked. And I'm always, my emphasis is on us, domestic. We peaked about 1990, around that 200 million barrels. We're still there as a, total in terms of imports and domestic, but we've been in a steady decline as an American brewing industry. Nothing wrong with a 50 IBU, whatever, but drinkability and, even with that, we are... Every 30, 40 years, we had these bursts of flowering times. And we were due for one about 20. We missed it based on what history tells us. And I get it in this towards the end. We were due. We've missed it. But there are definitely lessons of the past where lightness can be more than just calories, for sure. You can be lighter in alcohol, non-alcoholics. There's so many sensory attributes that can deliver to the consumer a lighter experience compared to what was available en masse. And, I think and I have no doubt that in the United States of America, that next flowering time is going to happen. And even recognizing it's in a funk, it's in a funk.
I think you might be able to argue that there was the craft brought on this flowering time that, and I think that this period of the early 20-teens, through, early 2020s was kind of, with the growth of breweries, this rebound where we, were at half of our historical peak of number of breweries when it started, and ended up now at 3 times that historical peak in terms of number of breweries. It's an interesting, different change, an unprecedented historical amount of growth in the history of American brewing. And there really isn't something that you could look back and say, hey, it's grown this fast, this quickly to this kind of scale, but kind of incredible.
Well, I have a broad. Every time I talk to them about American beer, I say, if you like beer, there's no better time in the history of mankind to be living in the United States of America right now. In terms and has
Amen.
been. Yeah, I mean,
Amen.
Amen. It's just,
even if it's rough, and there are certain business challenges.
Oh, yeah.
Right now,
and I was referring strictly to
right.
annual production as
Sure.
the only metric being volume.
Or as a beer drinker, someone who loves
experience.
drinking beer, and I say this all the time, there's never been a better time to be a beer drinker in the United States than right now. The quality, the breadth, the stylistic diversity, but also the quality of execution across all of these, and more breweries making better beer than they ever have in history. It is happening right now. And I think we can decouple that from the challenges that the industry as a whole, and specifically the craft beer industry, is facing, but also the larger beer industry, all changing that systemic decline at the top line, and some challenges even within craft, down here in this small subset of beer. That regardless of that, it's a great time to be a beer drinker.
It's fabulous. I've pitied my grandfather and father. I mean, all that generation was one style of beer. Yeah, it was in Canada, and it was kind of split between ales and lagers to more greater extent than the United States. It was just in the Northeast, but when I worked at Stroh, my father, Canadian prices are pretty high. So for the Canadian audience, there's a reason why in the United States it isn't a one-tier distribution system, whereas in Canada, brewer's retail, the brewer makes it distributes it retail. I don't think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the supply chain, to get the beer consistently right. Maybe there's time towards the end, I'll give you what I call an American moment with Bill Coors and Molson's. But yeah, where was I?
Well, let's, in fact,
back in.
We should probably bring this to a close, because I could talk about this history ad nauseum. As you think back to this long history of your own history within all of these major lager brewers in America, and this broad history that you've been a part of for a good at least 25 to 35% of its history. What do you think the big takeaways are there for brewers brewing today that they can apply to their own situation?
Whether you're craft or macro, I think we as those who love beer, those who make beer, those who influence it domestically and globally, we have abandoned our awareness in the general public of the history, heritage, and traditions of the American brewing industry. We've abandoned it. We don't know about it. We assumed, this beer started in 19. We don't know anything about what it took to bring it to life, to bring it to fruition, to allow it to live, not to have it extinguished like it was June 3rd, 1906 in Germany, the use of adjuncts. We have a history, whereas our competitive product, our industries, like I call that, my wife says the liquor industry, and I go, we call it distilled, but she was, so that the history of American wine, the history of American whiskey, and the public has a general sense of that. They know the history, they know the stories, they know the people. Well, our history is equally, if not more, fascinating. And it's not a history of, the Coors and they're the survivors of, if you will, of a history that was lived on the American stage by long forgotten people that, I just went up to last fall, 2021, to the Grand Hotel in Mackinac Island, because I went there because in 1908, first week of August, this Dr. Robert Wall, I told you, the FDA was created in 1906, even though it was FD. And they were doing standards for everything, right? Because food was a dangerous thing, and they were getting around the beer. And he opened his proceedings by saying, the all malt beer in America is extinct. Why resurrect it? It was 1908. And they were, they didn't call it the Reinheitsgebot, but, these commissioners, food commissioners. And one of the commissioners immediately replied in Latin, which always made me feel like I needed to suck my thumb in terms of how to educate these people, where why don't we then create a headstone saying, here rests the all malt beer in America? I mean, little visuals like that. So I guess to your question, I would say, my goal here is, once all five are out, is to, start promoting this. Right now it's, in the industry, people are aware of it. But this is geared to people that haven't ever stepped foot in the brewery. So my apologies to your, when they see extract, described as stuff that passes through, but
to celebrate American
our
brewing history, be proud of the American brewing history, not run away from it,
and learn from it,
understand the kind of dynamic interplay between that American brewing history and brewing around the entire rest of the world.
It's still happening.
Absolutely.
And there will be a third revolution of that, I'm sure, and it will be sparked here. I just don't know what it is yet, but of that I have total faith.
That is a great place to bring it to a close. G&D offers quality components, expert craftsmanship, and constant innovation. And with 24/7 service and support, your brewery will never stop. Unlock the ultra-low diacetyl cheat code with fresh strains from Berkeley Yeast. Try Old Orchard's custom blend program to dial in the perfect fruit flavor in your beer. Indie Hop Strata is available in every format you need, from Hyperboost to CGX pellets and classic T90s. Make life flavorful at indiehops.com. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. Isuzu trucks are the trucks you trust for the work you do. And get tickets now for the 2025 Craft Beer and Brewing Brewers Retreat at brewersretreat.com. If you're an all-access subscriber, you get $300 off tickets to that event. So, of course, you should be a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing and help us continue to bring you great perspectives on the history of brewing, of the technique of brewing. Greg, it's been fascinating to talk with you about this history. If people want to learn more, connect with you, pick up your books, read them, buy them so they can read them themselves. Where can they connect with you? Where can they read these books and all of those things?
Right now, there's only one place these could be purchased. It's through Master Brewers Association website. So go to the website, click on publications, sort of navigate your way through, find these. And just to be clear, I don't make a dime. I'm actually losing money with every volume sold because I'm donating 100% of author royalties. I've been very public about that right from the get-go. Because with 9/11 and realizing and seeing how many National Guard mums and dads didn't come home because the National Guard really took on a disproportionate load. And TAPS.org, if you Google that, it really supports the families and particularly the children. It's bad enough to lose an 18-year-old grunt, but so I don't make any money. So this isn't self-promotion as much as it might sound like it is, but I want people to know that, but it's there.
There is not gobs of money to be made writing about five volumes on American lager history. This is not a get rich quick scheme.
But you haven't seen my promotional plan yet. I'm going to start with Hulk Hogan, Troy Aikman, and the Kelsey brothers, and I'm deadly serious. If you look up lager beer and their names, they're American light lager. So I have a long 17-year plan, if you will, before I die to get the promotion part of this out there.
All right. Well, just don't George R.R. Martin us on this one and, take forever to get the next volumes out. I was thinking about it and, to quote the popular meme, it sounds to me like your Roman Empire is American lager history. And you know what? I'm here for all of it. So
it's a great story.
Yeah. So thanks for talking with me about it today. Right, and I can't wait to see the future versions of this.
Thanks
history.
for that.
Yeah.
I'll be glad to come back.
Fantastic. Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.